good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. So, welcome to the Law, Justice and Development Week 2023. LJD Week is an annual event hosted by the Legal Vice Presidency of the World Bank. We welcome both those in person and those online. It's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion on advancing female entrepreneurship by addressing legal barriers. In a moment, I will introduce a special guest speaker, but first, let me formally introduce the panel. Antonia Kirkland is Global Lead for Legal Equality and Access to Justice at Equality Now. Welcome, Antonia. Rishi Goyal is the Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund and Senior Advisor on Gender in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department. Welcome, Rishi. And online, we have Monica Musonda, CEO of Java Foods Limited, a Zambian-based food processing company, which Monica founded in 2012. Monica, welcome. As the session gets underway, I invite you to visit the website www.worldbank.org/LJD Week 2023 to learn more about this year's program. We will be taking questions throughout the session. For our virtual attendees, please click the link that you see directly under your streaming window to post questions. For our in-person attendees, please scan the QR code that you see on the screen behind me. Well, perhaps not the QR code that you see on the screen behind me. Or you can go, oh, there it is. Okay, perfect, over there. Or you can go to www.slido.com and type in the code. So we're expecting a very lively discussion, and we will try to get to as many of the questions as possible. You can also follow us on social media with the hashtag LJDWeek2023. Let me briefly provide some context to our conversation today. We gather this week in the midst of a global slowdown in the pace of reform related to equal treatment of women. Reform activity has actually slumped to a 20-year low. This reform fatigue has the potential to impede economic growth and resilience at a time when economic growth is actually slowing. Countries have been mobilizing full productive capacity in confronting unprecedented crises, from climate change to forced displacement from conflicts and the pandemic, crises that have impacted women and girls disproportionately. According to analysis for the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law report, women still have only 3/4 of the legal rights of men. Only 45% of economies explicitly prohibit gender discrimination in access to credit. Restrictive gender norms are still pervasive in some regions, hindering the implementation of laws. In some economies, limitations on a woman's mobility constrains her agency. As a result, women are less likely to be entrepreneurs. Worldwide, for every 68 female entrepreneurs, there are 100 men entrepreneurs. We know that legal reform is a proven way to address this problem. Significant improvement over the last 50 years has led most economies to allow women to sign contracts, register a business, and open a bank account in the same way as men. Despite the recent slump in reform activity, some of this progress has indeed been quite recent. For example, in 2022, Pakistan allowed women to register a business, and Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and Iraq have prohibited discrimination in access to credit based on gender. At the IFC, we are trying to encourage more women to become entrepreneurs. And for those who already are leading businesses, we want there to be more capital available to grow and create jobs, many of which will go to women. This is really critical, given that women entrepreneurs globally face unmet demand for credit, of $1.7 trillion. So at IFC, we are using our capital, advice, and convening power to address the multiple constraints faced by women entrepreneurs. Let me give you a few examples. We dedicate financing to women entrepreneurs. Through our Banking on Women business, we have invested and mobilized over $4.3 billion in support of women customers, working with 180 financial institution clients and across 76 countries. We engage regulators to illuminate how using gender data can be leveraged to accelerate financial inclusion for women entrepreneurs. Through our Women Insurance program, we have trained the senior management and staff of regulatory commissions in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Zambia on the importance of collecting and using insurance data to tailor risk mitigation products to the needs of women. And we bring together private sector companies and government actors to support the development of policies that enable women economic participation. In Fiji, IFC has worked with partners to establish a high-quality, accessible, and inclusive childcare market to empower women. IFC helped establish a peer learning platform to support 28 Fijian organizations in enhancing policies, attitudes, and practices related to employer-supported childcare. So now to our special guest speaker. We are glad to be joined by an individual who is well positioned to discuss how the World Bank engages with clients and partners to advance gender reform. Ethiopis Tafara is Vice President, Chief Risk, Legal and Sustainability Officer at the World Bank's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Ethiopis, please do come up and give us your opening remarks.
Friends, guests, advocates for gender equality, greetings and welcome to all. It's my pleasure to open today's session on advancing female entrepreneurship by addressing legal barriers, which is a pivotal and critical issue in the struggle for gender equality. Let me begin by highlighting the year 2310 and its relevance and meaning for the topic of this session. Do I have any hands from around the room on this significance? 2310 is the year that we would have removed all discriminatory laws for women and girls at the current pace of change, according to the UN. To put it in perspective, that is the equivalent of 10 generations from today. Certainly, we can do better. In the area of entrepreneurship, legal barriers create enormous complexities and obstacles for women in business. And you don't have to trust me on this matter. This year's Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences was awarded to Claudia Golden for her work on women in the labor markets, the first woman to win the prize solo, by the way. And in her recent paper, she offers a historical perspective on barriers women in the United States face over the past few decades. Being fired or demoted for being married, getting married, being pregnant or having children, denied credit and mortgages, having to use their husband's name on credit cards, treated differently than similarly situated men by the Internal Revenue Service, by the Social Security system, by the federal retirement system, and the military, having restrictions on their work hours and the types of jobs for which they were eligible. It was not until a flurry of legislative reforms prohibiting discrimination based on sex, race, and other protected classes that the legal landscape began to change. These included the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Education Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. This list is not exhaustive, but it illustrates the extent of change. Today, in the US, women-owned firms are growing at more than double the rate of all other firms, contribute nearly $3 trillion to the economy, and are directly responsible for 23 million jobs. And this does not mean that we have gender equality in the United States. Men and women experience the labor market, the workplace, and home differently. But they diverge far less than they did 50 years ago. Of course, changes to promote women's economic participation have not been limited to the United States. All over the globe, we've seen the lifting of legal barriers to women's economic empowerment. As a result, women can demonstrate the value of their participation in business and the economy. At MIGA, we host the annual Gender Leadership Award in recognition of the critical role women leaders play in advancing development. Their stories are as inspiring as they are humbling. The first recipient in 2016 was Noura Mayar, the CEO of Nafith Logistics, who received the award in recognition of her contribution to modernizing the logistics network in Iraq and for her work to integrate women into a male-dominated workforce in a sector where women's participation was extremely limited. This year's award was given to Claudia Maria González Arteaga, Chief Financial Officer at Bancoldex in Colombia. One of Claudia's many contributions has been developing a new product for Bancoldex targeted specifically to female entrepreneurs and which is designed to take into account women's dual roles as financial managers of their households and small enterprises. Women like our awardees are a testament to the development potential that can be unlocked by ensuring that women have the same opportunities to participate in the business world as men. In fact, in 2015, there was a study by McKinsey where they estimated that this full potential scenario would add 28 trillion to annual global GDP by 2025 as compared to business as usual. While celebrating progress, we need to be aware of the significant obstacles to further progress and even threats to reversing hard-won gains. In 2022, the global pace of reforms toward equal treatment of women under the law slumped to a 20-year low. Overlapping crises such as the global pandemic, climate change, and forced displacement disproportionately impacting girls, women, and sexual and gender minorities is further derailing progress. At the same time, deeply rooted gender norms, behaviors, and mindsets are strong impediments to making further headway and contribute to the rollback of reforms we thought were secure. Legal barriers around the globe that still constrain the potential of female entrepreneurs encompass a wide spectrum, from restrictions on property rights to limitations in accessing credit and navigating equity markets. These discriminatory laws and related norms and policies undermine the foundational rights of women, hindering their economic empowerment and overall societal development. We must also recognize the need to apply an intersectional lens to understand the differing circumstances that exacerbate inequalities among women, the varied contexts and complexities faced by women due to factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geographical location intensify the barriers they encounter, making it imperative to address these diverse challenges, especially in how we devise future laws and policies. But understanding the problem is just the beginning. We must identify actionable legal mechanisms and policy recommendations to eliminate discriminatory barriers. Creating environments conducive to female entrepreneurship requires a concerted effort from the development community. Engaging stakeholders is also crucial in driving gender-inclusive legal reforms. Collaborative efforts among government agencies, civil society, and the private sector can lead to creating an enabling environment that empowers women entrepreneurs. The institutions of the World Bank Group play a crucial role in serving as a bridge among stakeholders in promoting gender equality, particularly in the context of female entrepreneurship. We've been reflecting on how to accelerate the pace of change toward gender equality. Building on our experiences and lessons from implementing our first joint World Bank Group gender strategy, we have launched the Accelerate Equality campaign. As part of our ongoing efforts, we are poised to introduce the proposed new World Bank Group gender strategy for 2024 to 2030. The new strategy aims to accelerate gender equality for a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive future, and is anchored in 3 objectives. 1, ensuring foundational well-being. 2, expanding economic opportunities, and 3, engaging more women as leaders for a sustainable future. The strategy emphasizes the need to identify and address discriminatory legal barriers, ensuring equal access to economic opportunities and leadership roles for women. To drive this change, the World Bank Group will innovate, finance, and foster collective action, leveraging data and evidence for solutions to speed legal reforms. We recognize that securing and mobilizing the necessary resources, especially in times of fiscal constraints, will be vital to the strategy's success. Together, by recognizing and addressing legal barriers and by fostering collaboration between diverse constituencies, we can pave the way for an environment that empowers women entrepreneurs, leading to inclusive economic growth and social development. In closing, let me reiterate that no country, community, or economy can achieve its potential without the full and equal participation of everyone. I understand our panelists who will be sharing their expertise to delve into these issues more deeply. In addition, your participation, insights, and perspectives will be invaluable. Thank you for being part of this urgent and necessary dialogue. Together, we can create a world where gender equality thrives well in advance of 2310.
Thank you very much, Ethiopis. I think that was a wonderful framing of the conversation, and I think you've entrenched 2310 in my brain. So thank you. Thank you very much. Right, so we are now going to go to the panel conversation. And I'm going to shift myself this way so that we can have the conversation. We've organized the session in 3 rounds, and the first round is understanding the problem. So I wanted to start by asking the panel to unpack the problem for us. We good with the sound? Yep. Okay. Broadly speaking, how can discriminatory legal barriers hamper the promotion of female entrepreneurship, and why is addressing the problem vital for holistic economic and social development? And while we're unpacking this, let me add a nuance. Often we find it's hardest to work towards reform in the places that need it the most. What can we do about that? So I have specific questions for the panelists, and I'm going to start off with Antonia, who has roughly 6 minutes to give us her view. But from your human rights law perspective, and considering your work in addressing gender discrimination and sexual violence against women, can you elaborate on how legal frameworks can perpetuate gender disparities in entrepreneurship? Antonia, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and hopefully your questions at the end. If I may, I'll just say a couple of words about my organization, Equality Now. We're an international human rights organization founded in 1992. And our mission is to achieve legal and systemic change to end all forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls around the world. And we work in partnerships and in coalitions with international, regional, and national organizations. And with the Women, Business, and the Law team of the World Bank, we also advise UN Women on their equality and law strategy to accelerate action by 2030. So quite a bit quicker than 2310, we hope. So to answer your question as to how governments are perpetuating gender inequality when it comes to women's entrepreneurship, we see really 2 sort of paths that are throwing up those barriers. One, of course, is the explicitly sexist or discriminatory laws that have already been mentioned. And then secondly is the lack of equality and non-discrimination laws in place to protect women and girls' rights. So maybe I'll just say a little bit more first about the sexist laws and add to the examples that were given. And in addition, I wanted to mention that the Women, Business, and the Law report points out that 101 countries do not prohibit gender discrimination in access to credit. And credit, of course, is vital to women becoming entrepreneurs. And we're also very concerned in this day and age that artificial intelligence is also throwing up another barrier because there's gender biases built in many times in reviewing those credit applications, and so women are being denied credit on that basis. There's a great book called An Artificial Revolution by Ivana Bartoletti, which gives some concrete examples about that. But in terms of the laws that governments can easily repeal or amend that are prohibiting women's entrepreneurship, we still see in a handful of countries that women are not even allowed to register a business. They can't even open a bank account. Luckily, there aren't too many countries left in that sense. But there's also countries where women are specifically prohibited from performing certain jobs or participating in particular industries, or maybe performing a job at night. She also can't maybe access finance if she can't even own land or other property sort of as collateral. And then often she will be denied authority over assets during marriage. And finally, we see a lot of issues with inheritance. So in over 40 countries, women cannot inherit on the same basis of men, whether as widows or daughters. And often they will only be given half the share under the law. So in Tunisia, for example, we see Halima, who's struggling to feed her children. She has a sick husband. She was given half a share of her father's inheritance, but then in practice, she was pressured by the rest of her family to give over that inheritance to her brothers. So she's really struggling. So this is the daily impact of those restrictions on women's rights to property. And of course, if women and girls are under the law meant to obey their husbands, this can lead to an increase in domestic violence, marital rape, all the sort of horrible environment that is not going to be conducive to women going out into the workforce or starting a business. She may also have restrictions on her reproductive rights, which will also slow down her participation. And speaking of reproductive rights in children, we see that still in this day and age, over a quarter of countries allow women, or girls rather, to be married off at a younger age than boys. A quarter of the countries of the world. That's a huge amount, affecting millions of girls every year. And that means that their education is often impacted. And if their education is impacted, logically, it's much harder to get into the labor force and start those businesses. So even here in the United States, only 10 states have laws prohibiting marriage under the age of 18 without exception. That means 40 states still allow often girls to be married off at a younger age. Our partner, Unchained at Last, shared the story of Carol, who was just 14 years old when she was raped, impregnated, and then married off to her rapist. She said, "We stood before a judge and he married us. On the way home, he took me to my school and told me to go inside and quit. I was a married woman now, so no need for school. That was the longest walk of my life." Well, miraculously, Carol somehow did eventually become a business owner, but that took many, many years and perseverance, and I think is probably an exception, unfortunately. So just to come back to the other avenue where we see that there's a lack of positive equality laws and non-discrimination. This is a human right to have equality in your laws, starting with your Constitution. We see that in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and many other human rights treaties. And again, I happen to live here in the United States where we don't even have an Equal Rights Amendment yet to our Constitution. So this means that there's potential for laws to be introduced that are more discriminatory, or if my rights are violated when I go to the Supreme Court, my case will not be given the same weight as other cases because we don't have explicit gender equality in the Constitution yet. And of course, we've already seen the impact with reproductive rights, which has a knock-on effect, of course, with women's labor force participation. And in terms of family leave policies, another sort of positive type of policy, we hope, we only see 53 countries that have paid paternity leave. Most countries do have paid maternity leave, but again, not the United States. So we have some work to do here and around the world, I would say. And then just a final note to say that in addition, of course, to sexist laws and the lack of positive laws fostering an enabling environment, there's gender stereotypes, which I'm sure we'll hear about more, that no matter what the law is, may also inhibit women's entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia. That was fascinating and daunting as well when you think about the numbers and the approach. I'm going to turn now to Monica and bring in the perspective of a female entrepreneur. And you really must have had to face many forms of bias over your experience and in establishing your company. So some of these challenges are certainly attributable to behaviors, but there are also systemic challenges that arise due to legal hurdles. What has been your personal experience as a female entrepreneur in Zambia with respect to such legal obstacles or the lack of legal reform? And are there any specific legal challenges targeted to women in the private sector that society needs to be more aware of and sort of, address? Monica, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and allowing me to participate virtually. Let me give you some context. I had a career, a very successful career in law. I actually spent a few years at the World Bank and decided to move back to my home country of Zambia and to become an entrepreneur because I really felt that we needed to move the dial on development. I was very interested in creating local brands, in creating jobs, and really changing how food processing and how we bought food in Zambia. You may know that Zambia actually grows food very well, but we still import a lot of our products. And there I saw an opportunity with actually very little background. And I thought, well, I had worked many years in law, had great network, and surely this could not be so difficult. And I was very surprised how actually very difficult it was, despite of all, firmly standing on my experience. It was actually really difficult to start the business and then to grow the business and to finance the business. And you can imagine for myself, if that was difficult, for many, many other women in Zambia, or on the continent, it's much harder as well. And one, we've talked about definitely perception and culture. This definitely plays a very strong part. Just to share a story, when I started the business a few years in, I was very confident. And I was saying to a gentleman, quite a senior person, that I'm in the food processing sector. And then he asked me what the name of my restaurant was. And I was really pushed aback because I thought, why would he think it was a restaurant and not actually a manufacturing unit? Because we actually are a manufacturer with over 100 people producing packaged food with a brand. And it just, for him, he couldn't connect the two, that women would have much smaller businesses, would definitely not be in the manufacturing or food processing sector, which is very dominated by men and multinationals. And perhaps this is just, just looking at me, it was not possible. So those are the biases we are still experiencing on the continent, and particularly here in Zambia, where certain sectors are still predominantly male focused, more not because of the lack of skill or women being available, but merely about perception. But to answer your question about legal barriers, and more specifically, I'll speak about Zambia, where I have my business and what I know. I started the business in 2012 and scaled the business using money from my savings, and then I approached the bank. And in Zambia, we are fortunate that we are one of the countries where the constitution does guarantee equality. We are seeing that women can hold fixed property in their own names. They can inherit, they can use security, fixed assets as security for loans, can access financing. So beautiful laws, but the proof is in the pudding when these laws are actually not implemented, or there is a very big bias in how they're implemented, and we have heard this being talked about previously. So we have seen, and I have seen on a personal level, for instance, because we have a dual system of property ownership. We have property which is under the chiefs, or called traditional land, and then there's property owned by the state, in which you get a certificate of title, and you can use this to actually go to a bank or financial institution and raise capital to expand your business. Most women here in Zambia actually will probably have, own a piece of land they've inherited, or have been able to get consent from their chief to farm or do business on, but have not formalized it. And the attempt in which to formalize or to change your traditional land into a state or titled property is expensive. It is not an easy process, and it takes so long that many women just feel, well, people will know I own this property. But that acts as a detriment, because they are not then able to use this property as collateral for security for financing to expand their business. This has an impact of leaving many women-run businesses as micro businesses, because they're not able to use all their assets to grow a business. So I think this we are seeing quite common. Still few women owning landed, titled property in Zambia, and still the financial services system leaning much more towards fixed assets to finance as security for collateral. On that point, what is very interesting for Zambia is that we saw earlier on in the let's say 2015, 2016, a discussion in Parliament about putting together a movable property security interest bill, which was basically, there was a recognition that not many people actually own titled assets, and therefore there was need to open this up to allow people to use movable assets to access financing. And I think that was a step in the right direction, and it went through Parliament. It actually is an act, it's legislative, but what has happened since then is your question. And that is where we have lagged behind. So we talk about there's no unified registry, which is a big thing for financial institutions, just to make sure that this car or the cattle you're using is actually not already encumbered. That registry has still not been set up. It has now been almost 6 to 7 years, and we're still not seeing government move the dial to make this much more effective. So whilst I praise Zambia in the fact that they've taken a step forward and they have done many of the right things where other countries may be slow, we're still not seeing the real work being done to make sure it's effective. And on a personal level, you will see that you can walk in a bank, even if you qualify, the amount of paperwork that you have to do, and even if you're educated, how long it takes you to get through it. And this is not necessarily affordable financing. So we definitely have a gap, one, in making sure that women are able to, one, access financing, to actually get the financing, and then to grow the business.
Monica, thank you very much. That was a wonderful articulation of your own experiences and some of the challenges that you indeed face and continue to face. Rishi, coming to you now, you have written extensively on the issues of global gender gaps and the impact that that has on society, including specifically around access to finance. Can you give us some key findings or insights from this research and your work with the IMF that highlight the impact of these disparities on economic growth and development?
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Anastasia, for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Very nice to be with Antonia and Monica, very impressive as well. So point number one is we see gender disparities as macro-critical. So gender disparities not only impact the women, but it impacts society as well, both negatively when they're there and positively when they're closed. Evidence is very, very clear. Narrowing gender gaps not only boosts economic growth and equality or inclusion, but it also fosters greater financial stability. The mechanism that's underlying it fundamentally is very, very simple. It's the misallocation of talent. So when boys and girls are born, basically talent is, you can think of it as evenly distributed. But when we have disparities in access to education, disparities in access to health, disparities in access to opportunities in the labor market, to credit, as was being mentioned, because of legal barriers, because of social norms, because of policies, because of discrimination, whatever, we end up with a situation where we are misallocating resources, underdeveloping these resources, and underdeploying these resources. Now, Ethiopis and others already talked a bit about some of the facts. If we simply talk about one thing, which is if women were to work as much as men in the formal labor market, the gains would be very substantial. Some work that my colleagues have done have shown for the average emerging market, you would get an increase of 23% of GDP. I think that was in line with the McKinsey result that Ethiopis was talking about. For some countries, it's as much as 45 to 50% of GDP. This is very, very substantial. Now, going back to one of your framings, which was growth, the medium-term growth outlook is the weakest in decades. And part of the reason why the medium-term growth outlook is the weakest is because of trade tensions and the fact that trade is no longer going to be the engine of growth going forward. But here we have, within most economies, underdeveloped, underdeployed, misallocated productive human resources. If we were to put these in train, then you would have much, much more benefits that would come from it. So that's, very simply the link between gender disparities and macroeconomic outcomes. Now, turning to what are some of the drivers of these gender disparities? We've already talked a bit. I think my colleagues have spoken about the legal barriers, access to collateral, the use of these collateral for getting credit, and so on and so forth. We tend to think of this as disparities in outcomes, disparities in opportunities, and disparities in decision-making. So disparities in outcome are quite simple. Women tend to work less in the formal labor markets, more informal jobs, more part-time jobs, more insecure jobs, wage gaps, and so on and so forth. In opportunities, it has to do, and legal barriers here are the classic driver of differences in opportunities. If you have laws where gender equality is not embedded in there, then very clearly the opportunities are going to be very different, and these are illustrated in access to bank accounts, formal bank accounts, access to credit, and so on and so forth that we have discussed. It's also disparities in decision-making. If we were to go, and many of us trot around evidence-based policymaking, and if we were to look at the evidence in evidence-based policymaking, it is so obvious that gender-balanced teams, because of the diversity of views, diversity of experiences, lead to both better results at the firm level and the economy-wide level, as well as more stability. So the evidence is irrefutable that moving towards gender-balanced teams is much better. But I think we just have to look around, look at the number of finance ministers, presidents, prime ministers, central bank governors, CEOs of commercial banks, board directors, and we are nowhere close to utilizing evidence-based policymaking to that end. Now, in terms of the drivers of these gender disparities, we've talked a bit about legal impediments to these, and you've quoted from the Women, Business and Law report as well. But in addition, there are other factors that tend to drive it. So economic and financial shocks, and I think Ethiopis was talking about vulnerability to things like climate change, but this is true when it comes to fragility, it comes to various economic shocks. It comes also from the structure of the types of jobs. So informal jobs are the ones that tend to be let go of relative to formal permanent jobs. Violence, child marriage. I think here the evidence again, by eliminating or reducing significantly violence, child marriage, we've seen work in individual countries like Niger, where the gains can be very substantial from education, being longer in schools, but then also entering and remaining in labor markets. The same is true for the care economy. I want to come back to Ethiopia's point of 2310. So there are many organizations that come out with different numbers. The Women, Business and Law report also talks about 50 years. I think you talked about close to 300 years. So unfortunately, the news is worse, right? Actually, it's not a linear trend towards progress. You quoted Iraq. Well, there's also the Afghanistans of this world. There are the Yemens of this world. There are places where we're making progress in some parts and in some episodes of time, and then we have regress. And because we have regress, including in this country, as Antonia spoke about, the actual answer is, and we've looked at this very carefully with the data and different methods, that under current policies and current efforts, the gap is never going to close. And what this means is we really need to prioritize moving forward if we actually want to do evidence-based policymaking. Thank you.
Right, on that incredibly sobering note. All right, I'm going to lead us into the second round of discussion, which is addressing the key legal barriers. And we're going to show a video produced by Women Business and the Law team regarding the interrelationship between development and gender equality. So let's have a look.
To end poverty on a livable planet, we need gender equality. Gender equality is critically important. It benefits not only women, but also societies and economies, making them more dynamic and resilient. Evidence presented in the latest edition of the Women, Business and the Law report shows that equal treatment of women under the law leads to better economic outcomes and development for women.
First, the ability to act independently and work without legal limitations allows women to access better jobs and lead to higher labor force participation overall. Second, freedom from discrimination helps women to become entrepreneurs and access finance. And third, family leave policies are correlated with women's empowerment. Implementing reforms that overcome legal gender barriers help entire economies become more robust in the face of shocks like the recent pandemic. So, how much progress has the world made in addressing gender inequality under the law? Unfortunately, progress toward equal treatment for women has fallen to the weakest pace in over 2 decades. At this rate of change, it will take more than 50 years for the world to reach gender equality in all areas of the law.
Since 2021, 18 economies introduced a total of 34 reforms towards gender equality across the 8 areas measured by the Women's Business and the Law Project. But to achieve gender equality, more countries need to accelerate implementation of reforms that strengthen women's participation in social, economic, and political life and incentivize them to enter the labor force as employees and entrepreneurs. The World Bank stands ready to support countries in promoting gender equality. To learn more, go to wbltheworldbank.org.
To end poverty on a livable planet, we need
gender equality!
Okay, thank you very, very much for that. So, going on to round 2, clearly we have our work cut out for us in terms of addressing these legal challenges. And you know, if the aim is to create this environment that is conducive to promoting the participation of women in the economy, both as entrepreneurs and as workers, we need to sort of figure out what path forward we need to take. So I'd like to start by asking the panel, what actionable legal mechanisms and policy recommendations can indeed be employed to eliminate discrimination in credit access and in participation in debt and equity markets for female entrepreneurs? So I'm going to go with the same order that we had before. Antonia, starting with you. Legal reform is often seen as a catalyst for advancing female entrepreneurship. How can legal frameworks play a pivotal role in creating an enabling environment for women to start and grow businesses? And what are the key aspects that need reform? Also, and given your expertise, how do human rights principles guide legal mechanisms for gender equality? And are there global best practices that we can learn from when tackling sector-specific disparities? Over to you, Antonia.
Yes, I have to take a deep breath after hearing we might never get to legal equality, but I think maybe first we have to take a step back and think about the political will of governments and how do we encourage that, because they have committed over and over to getting rid of discrimination in the law as sort of a basic tenet of human rights in treaties, also in the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are supposed to be achieved by 2030. Also in the Beijing Platform for Action, which was like sort of the first big blueprint for women's rights adopted in 1995. So we really have to encourage governments to do everything they can to review their legislation very comprehensively, so not just the laws that affect women's business ownership or entrepreneurship, but really, yeah, holistically, I think, if we want to get anywhere to seeing women's numbers increase to get on parity with men. So, of course, you know, they have to eliminate the obviously discriminatory laws in terms of finance and opening a bank account and having a husband's permission to leave the home. You know, we see that in, countries like Afghanistan that Rishi mentioned. It's written into the law that she has to have permission to leave the house. So how will she get a job if she can't step outside? We also need to see those non-discriminatory and positive equality laws put in place. And then family leave policies, again, are so important, not just in terms of taking care of children, but also elderly parents. We see that women again and again are suffering time poverty and are, you know, they're having to do those second shifts unpaid, which is inhibiting greater participation. And they're, you know, beyond their income and access to income, also just their well-being, their right to education, the right to live a life free of violence. I think secondly, in addition to political will, we really need to see women in parliaments making those decisions in those leadership positions. We've seen evidence that when there's more women in parliaments, there are better laws, not surprisingly, that do help gender equality. We see right now that, according to the Interparliamentary Union, only 26.7% of parliaments are made up of women parliamentarians. So it's just over a quarter. We need to do better. I think we also need to see women at the top of international institutions, like the United Nations. We've never had a woman Secretary General. We got close in the last round, but didn't quite get there. I think, and no matter how feminist a man is, we still need that lived experience also to be brought to that kind of a position. And then finally, I think as we move more and more into the virtual and digital world, we do need to see a sort of global agreement as to how we're going to treat each other in that world. And to have those women in parliaments, if they're being attacked online as candidates or once they're in those positions, that's going to hurt everybody, not just the women, but I think society as a whole. We're really hoping that the UN's upcoming Global Digital Compact, which is supposed to be adopted next year, will reflect those feminist principles that will help regulate the online and virtual world. I think to come to your second question, as to how human rights guide legal mechanisms for gender equality, I think, as I mentioned before, gender equality is sort of a non-negotiable in international law. You know, even where there's sort of justifications in some countries' mind because of religion or tradition or custom, you know, the UN has been very clear and international law is very clear that, for example, freedom of religion and belief cannot impact gender equality in a negative way. And in terms of global best practices to tackle that inequality, there was an interesting study done by the European Parliament a couple of years ago, and others like Generation Equality at the UN have also supported this, that among the factors that really do facilitate that legal reform are countries living up to international law, so not just ratifying it and signing it, but actually implementing it, taking away those reservations. So if they say, well, we'll sign this, but we're not going to live up to Article 16, for example, which calls for equality in family law, we're just not going to tackle that, we're going to accept ourselves, that can really inhibit things. But if they list that reservation and really implement it the way those treaty committees guide them on how to do it, that will certainly promote gender equality. And then the study also found, of course, that political dialogue and increased women's representation in decision-making does help foster that legal reform. And I think coalition work of human rights organizations, women rights organizations on the ground, as well as with sort of UN agencies that are promoting those women's rights. For example, there's a global campaign for equal nationality rights that in the last not even decade has managed to secure over a dozen legal reforms in citizenship and nationality, which also impacts how women and their families participate in the labor market. So I'll just stop there maybe with those few examples. Thank you.
Those were wonderful examples, and I think sort of incredibly relevant to see the potential effort, both at the government level as well as through agencies that can move the needle. So thank you very much, Antonia. Monica, coming to you, I want to draw again on your own experience as an entrepreneur, and in fact, having worked with women entrepreneurs at the grassroots level as well as on a national scale. And I wanted you to share some insights for the audience on the types of legal reforms that you believe would be most beneficial for women across all sectors and social spectrums so that we can push gender equality around entrepreneurship. And then I also wanted to ask you on to share some practical measures that your company has implemented to support your female colleagues and other women in achieving leadership roles, starting new businesses, gaining access to credit, and what impact these measures have had on promoting gender diversity and entrepreneurship, sort of tackling the barriers that we indeed are speaking about. Monica, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Two really great questions, and I only have 6 minutes. So I'm going to try really hard to fit everything in. On the legal reforms that are required, I think the first thing we have to do is really ensure we have trust. A lot of the legal reforms we have seen over the past few years have been done in isolation to what women need right now to get more involved in entrepreneurship, and also trust that these laws are being done for their betterment. So if you ask women today, they may not know there's actually a movable property act, which actually benefits them, and because they think that actually does not apply to them. So I think a lot of the legal reform has to be a lot more talking with policymakers about really where the soft points are, where we can really make quick wins and really change things around quickly and actually show those wins. I mean, it's great to hear the statistics. But do people really appreciate what these statistics mean? Do our parliamentarians, do our government officials, do the women understand what this means? You know, so I think generally the first step I would love to see is much more dialogue to create trust in the legal reform process. Just quickly answer the question on where I think the legal reform should start in Zambia, again, because this is where I live. I would love to see more reform in the property land ownership space because of the dual system we have, and that women are actually still outside of the system to have titled property, and which prevents them then using this property in order to raise capital for their businesses. Would love to see much more on closing the gaps around the movable property bill. We would also like to see some incentives being given to financial institutions that are actually actively promoting understanding women, sectors where women play, understanding how women need the financing. Sometimes it may be not all at once, maybe it's through an invoice discounting mechanism. We want to partner with those financial institutions that understand how women run their businesses and how they need support. And they should be incentivized when they do that. And we can do that by encouraging central banks to let them report on it. Banks report on an annual basis, but they report all sorts of other things, but they very rarely report on how they impact women-run businesses and gender. We rarely see that. Why can't we be asking that, some form of moral suasion to get them to report more about what they're doing around financing and growing women-run businesses and supporting government's efforts in getting more women into entrepreneurship? and incentivizing them, allowing them to access overnight window at cheaper rates, things of that nature. I think we need to think very differently if we're really going to achieve those numbers. On to your second question, which is very personal, and it really, I love the question because you're really questioning me and what I am doing in my own institution. It's not enough just to be a female founder. I mean, it's great, right? But you have to be much more focused and intentional about ensuring that you are supporting your whole ecosystem, meaning your female employees, your female suppliers, and your female customers. And we actually, the business had to actually go through gender mainstreaming to really understand how to be more effective about it. So if I could give an example internally about how we hire, we all had to go into training about really understanding how do you put up an ad, what do you need to be saying to encourage more female applicants? How do we show that we're flexible, we are open to more female applicants? How do we go about interviewing? The onboarding process is now much more important because we want to make sure we understand the issues that are affecting women in the workplace and that we're able to balance that out, and even how we do professional development. So all those things are very important for us at Java. I'm really happy to report we are over 100 people, of which 46% are women through a deliberate effort. My board, 50% of us are women. My senior management team, 50% of us are women. And it makes a difference in how we run the business. We are much more empathetic. I've got to say this, the target market of my customers is actually mostly women. So even how we speak to our customers is much more different because we understand what they need. So it's actually benefited the business by having more women in the business, and we can show this in our revenue. So I think I'm very happy to say this, that Java is one of those prime examples where through intentional gender mainstreaming, it has actually made a big difference. What we need to do, however, is share more of the positive stories and share more of the successes so other people come along and make even small changes in order to achieve these great goals.
Monica, that's great, and kudos to you in your everyday effort to support this issue and really move the needle on the ground in Zambia. Rishi, over to you now. So I was wondering if you could really give us some insights into how you think, and through the work that the IMF does, that we can tackle these barriers and sort of shape policy. You've been very vocal about the need for significant policy changes to bridge gender gaps. And what are some of the specific policy changes that you would want to highlight or recommend to effectively address these barriers and promote gender equality and foster female entrepreneurship? Over to you, Rishi.
Thank you, Anastasia. I should say I was really excited to listen to Monica and to Antonia on the things that they were saying, because we're trying to do, at least in our organization, the same thing. Last year, in July 2022, the IMF put out its first gender mainstreaming strategy. And the goal of that is to take a systematic, intentional lens of integrating gender into our core macroeconomic policy work. So in other words, bring gender into our core macro advice, and outside the institution to bring macroeconomics more into the gender discussion. Why? Because we believe these policies, all of these policies that have been mentioned, but also fiscal policies, monetary policies, financial sector regulations, not just legal reforms, but also issues of leadership and composition of teams, regulators, and so on and so forth can make a difference for stronger, more inclusive economic outcomes. But let me start also by saying that country specificities matter, right? So even though we are seeing common problems, the solutions will need to be tailored to the individual country. And the reason for that is the drivers of these disparities can be quite different across the countries, plus how they interact with other policies would matter. Now, you asked specifically about individual policy examples, and Antonia already gave some, Monica also gave some on the legal reforms in particular. Some of my colleagues have been working on issues that run across constitutional law, property law, as was mentioned, family law, labor law, social security, pension law, tax law. So it just cuts across many domains. And part of it, could start with, as was mentioned, introducing a non-discrimination clause based on gender in constitutions and establishing guarantees in that regard. But then it's not just de jure, it has to be de facto, right? And there is where the rubber often hits the road. Let me talk a little bit about financial sector reforms. And here, this goes to things like proportionate regulation, because a lot of banks, cooperative banks, or so on, they serve underserved populations. And it's important to have proportionately the type of regulation so that it's not more burdensome for women entrepreneurs when they come. It has to do with things like financial literacy. Give you an example from India, where a small community bank was unwilling to serve women farmers because they didn't know how to read and write. But their response was, you need to know numbers. You don't necessarily need to know how to read and write, although they went out and learned how to read and write in order to be able to do that. Fintech is a very nice opportunity to try and level the playing field. But the problem there is the digital divide can actually exacerbate the gender divide, because there's lack of access, or there are disparities in women having access to mobile phones or the internet, or not just in terms of assets, collateral that they might have. So policies that could be geared towards leveling the playing field over there, in terms of improving digital literacy, could also go an important way. There are other types of reforms promoting alternative sources of collateral, alternative sources of ways of building credit histories. I think Monica was talking a little bit about that. There's types of teams that are set up. Of course, within banks, there's evidence that when you have female loan officers, they give out more loans to women entrepreneurs. And in fact, these tend to be, this goes to the data point, these tend to have lower non-performing loans, yet they are charged higher interest rates because it has to do with lack of access to collateral. But if you look at the data, if these ladies have, women entrepreneurs have lower non-performing loans, in fact, they should be charged less. So we do need to build a lot more data on this and have more evidence-based approach to policy making in that regard. Let me switch a little bit to a different type of reforms, product market reforms. Now, a lot of women work and women entrepreneurs work in the services sector. And the services sector tends to be the one in which there are many rather stringent regulations, and these regulatory burdens come back and hit, and that limits opportunities that people have. This interacts with things like stringent regulations on childcare. And clearly there are many women who prefer to have the flexibility in terms of time and the time that they work in order to be able to meet some of the care needs that they might have. So this is an opportunity, but it is also a hindrance. So laws that try to make it easier, or public services that make it a bit easier in that regard, can provide greater flexibility for women to come in. There's fiscal policy. Because time is short, I'm just going to be very, very quick. Things like infrastructure, which benefits the underserved even more. Tax policy, taxes on secondary earners who tend mostly to be women. Things like tax deductions for childcare. A whole bunch of these policies in which a gender lens could be brought that could allow a more holistic approach to achieving both better macro stability outcomes, but also narrow gender gaps through which you get benefits for the rest of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rishi. I think the nuance angle as well as the gender lens are, super important to think about. But clearly, we all have our work cut out for us in these areas. So heading to the last round of our discussion, which is a little bit more of a lightning round. We've explored the significance of legal barriers. We've discussed actionable mechanisms for change. Now, I sort of wanted to turn the conversation a little bit more to engaging stakeholders and the private sector in terms of really pushing gender-inclusive legal reforms. And success will only happen if we have collaboration across different stakeholders, including government agencies, civil society, and the private sector. So this is an opportunity for us to identify or discuss different strategies for working together to create this enabling environment that supports women entrepreneurs. So the question to each of the panelists is, if you had to pick a priority, what strategy have you found most effective in fostering collaboration between local stakeholders and the private sector to advocate for gender-inclusive legal reforms? So, Antonia, over to you, please.
Yeah, I think I mentioned at the beginning that we work with partners at every level and all around the world. And I think really one of the most effective ways we found of fostering that collaboration for specific legal reforms is really just bringing people together from all walks of life that can influence that legal change, from parliamentarians to civil society to funders to UN partners as well. So for example, at the end of 2016, our colleagues and partners in the Middle East brought together parliamentarians, civil society organizations to really strategize on a final push around ending marry a rapist laws. These are laws that allow a rapist to marry his victim and either go unprosecuted or have his punishment lifted, and we saw real energy from that. And just 6 months later, Jordan and Lebanon followed Tunisia in repealing those laws. So we had a follow-up convening with neighboring countries at the end of that year, which again brought together parliamentarians, civil society, and the funder for that program. And again, another country overturned their law, and we continue to see progress with Bahrain this summer repealing their law. So that was a very, very tangible and specific legal reform. I think obviously we don't get those quick wins very often necessarily, because legal reform can take a long time. So I think in terms of private sector, at Equality Now, we really look for those corporate partners that are in it for the long haul, that are really ready to invest sort of in that social and feminist movement building. So I'll just name 2 examples. We've been really lucky to have Gucci invest in our Hara coalition of the Middle East, which brings together 15 organizations from 9 countries to work on family law issues, including financial rights after divorce, where in many countries women are left with nothing when they get divorced, and that also obviously impacts how they can move forward, whether it's as, just in the labor market, let alone as an entrepreneur. And then we also work with Adobe. That is a company that has a women's a global women's employee resource network, where we share and exchange through Ask the Activist sessions with our local partners, be able to exchange on what priorities they see also that need reform. And we've also been lucky to benefit from their operational expertise too, so that we can be better partners to local organizations. And then I think finally, in terms of private sector collaboration, and I know there's a lot of lawyers in the room, really pro bono law firm help is essential for us as a human rights organization that also uses strategic litigation as a strategy, both in terms of like the actual excellent research that they perform, but also the investment in covering the strategic litigation costs. So I think for us, partnership is just critical to the work that we do, and we've seen it really have an impact. So we do see progress, but of course we want to see more. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Antonia. So Monica, over to you as well now, please.
Sure. I definitely agree with Antonia on her view or her perspective on how to do it. Is really to get everybody together, the key stakeholders, private sector, and to get them speaking a lot more. However, I think what we need to also focus on is making sure it's a priority. It needs to, everyone needs to realize how important this is to really change many of our societies, to develop and change the lives of people here. and then try and build trust and create solutions around this. Because I think all too often it is considered, well, it's the policy guys and they're going to do something which may or may not impact us and we don't really care. But I think the idea is to bring everybody along and create a type of consensus around what the problem is and how, even if it's over a period of time, how we're going to address it. So I believe what we have seen very successful here on the ground is somehow creating some champions, really sponsoring, letting the champions speak to why we're doing the why and perhaps the how, and speaking to various stakeholders, whether they're private sector, government, or civil society, and trying to get some form of consensus on approach. Oftentimes we're seeing that through, the champions, it's almost a little bit of PR as well, because you want to highlight success stories. You want people to see that it is possible for things to change if we do these steps. And we are seeing that by doing A, B, and C, this is what we're getting, and we're talking about this much more. A lot of more positive storytelling, if I can say that, around all the reforms we're doing. And that way, it will allow more people to buy in as you go further down and as you tackle much harder things, right? So I think for me, that would be a way to bring about some form of consensus with all stakeholders. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Monica. Rishi?
Thank you. For us, the priority is to bring the conversation to ministers of finance and central bank governors. Usually when this conversation takes place, it is either happening in civil society or parts of the private sector or the Ministry of Gender or Women and Family Affairs or Legal Affairs. The conversation hardly ever happens with those who manage the purse strings as to where resources can be allocated, or in terms of financial sector supervision regulation with the supervisors or with the central bank governors. This tends to be, and it goes back to a story that Monica was saying about the blind corners, blind spots. When this topic is raised, the reality is people's eyes glaze, and it's somebody else's problem. It's not my problem. For us, we want to bring this front and center into the conversation by showing how gender is an opportunity, not just for inclusion, but for growth, how this can alleviate constraints, but also why its drivers are manifold and why policies need to be intentional about that. Of course, this also means this is not just a bilateral conversation with ministers of finance and central bank governors. We do need to talk with civil society, people on the ground, people who have the expertise. And I'll give you one concrete example. In one country, some of my colleagues decided that it would make a lot of sense in consultation with the authorities to mandate childcare provision in companies of a certain size. So the idea was, relatively large corporations, they have the cash flow, they have the women. If you have these childcare centers that are provided by them, of course, you can allow the women to stay more in the labor force. As it turns out, most of those companies reduced their hiring of women workers to below the threshold so they could close the cost centers, these childcare centers that they had. So it had the negative effect. The intention was good, but the impact was actually the opposite. And the reason for that is because people didn't, I guess, fully appreciate how in that context, these threshold effects might apply. So the conversation needs to include a lot of people, but for us, the priority is to be sure we're at least having this in our economic policies. Thank you.
Fascinating example, really. Okay, so for those of you online or in the room, if you have any additional questions, please do use the QR code or www.slido.com, I think, slido.com, so that I can ask the panel your remaining questions. So I've got a couple of them right now that I'm going to ask. So the first one is, are states considering gender reforms only to get international aid? Maybe Rishi, is that something I can palm to you?
I don't think so. The conversations on gender, to be honest, in policy discussions, at least the ones that we've been involved in, are very, very early stage. They're very nascent. This is not so much about getting money. To me, the conversation really starts with removing those blind spots, being intentional, understanding what the biggest disparities are, How are the opportunities? What are the drivers? And what can policy do about it? This is not about a little bit of money that comes. It's far beyond that. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So, Monica, I'm going to ask this one to you, and then Rishi and Antonia can add as well. But how do we expand female participation as workers, especially in industries that have had a low level of representation historically?
That's a great question. We're seeing this in the mining sector here in Zambia, where we haven't had. Previously, we did actually have restrictions where women weren't allowed underground, and we have seen those restrictions being removed. But now we're seeing a lot of the mining companies say, well, wait, we haven't got any trained female operators. So what's happening now is a bigger discussion around how do we train more women? How do we equip technical training schools? And how do we get the private sector to pay for it? So here in Zambia, in particular sectors, we're actually charged a skills development levy, which is then a portion of, it's a percentage of your PAYE, which goes into a pool which supports actually building skills in your sector. And you see, we don't push back on it because we actually can only increase our business or grow our businesses through skills. We recognize that this is actually really important. So we are actually seeing that through initiatives like this, which are done in consultation with private sector and government, we are seeing now we are actually able to train. So as long as you have your basic qualifications, and now what we need to do is actually say, we want to encourage more women to apply. Actually, that's what we need to be saying. But we can say that we're actually moving forward in those sectors where we have seen fewer women apply or become workers in those sectors. So it's just a more deliberate effort with particular sectors, yeah.
Okay, great. Rishi, do you want to come in as well?
So number one is this is a process. It starts by removing some of the barriers, but we need to constantly be alert to the fact that we need to keep working on it. So this is number one, building a pipeline of people who are coming in, making sure they have the support, they have the mentorship, there are role models, and then iterating, because we will find, as we do in many fields, that it takes quite a while before you get to gender parity. We also need to be a bit patient.
Antonia, do you want to come in on that one?
I think the only thing I would add, I think, is in terms of education and schooling from a young age, if you see those role models, as you mentioned, women in those types of positions or sectors, that could be quite inspiring for young girls and boys too. Thank you.
Thank you. So another question that we have is, considering the reality of legal barriers, why is there such slow progress? What can we do to speed up the process? So Rishi, you'd spoken about patience, but I guess you also have to push in the same vein. So maybe we start with you and then go to Antonia and Monica.
Right. Just to be clear, I don't mean patience as in it's okay, because otherwise we will never close gender gaps, right? We do need to be intentional, and we need to push forward. I would say prioritize, right? It needs to be a sequenced, we need to understand the crux of the problem, understand the elements of the solution, have a sequencing strategy, and continue and persist and persevere. There's just no shortcut. I don't think there's any country that has been able to achieve it very quickly. On the other hand, we do know of countries like Saudi Arabia, like Japan, like Tanzania, where strong leadership or focused leadership, India is another example. Last year, their mantra was from women development to women-led development, which they tried to bring into their policies intentionally. Where there is strong leadership, you can actually quite quickly break down social norms and barriers and able to make progress. But it has to be part of an overarching intentional strategy that's hitting this. Thank you.
That's perfect. Prioritization works in most spheres of life. Okay, Antonia.
I think in addition to everything we already spoke about, repealing those discriminatory laws and enacting positive legislation, I think there really has to be investment on the part of governments and private sector. So, funding to women's rights organizations is minuscule around the world. And even to UN Women, which is the dedicated UN agency on women's rights, they're one of the least funded of all the UN agencies in the system. So if we want to see progress, we really have to, put the money where the words are as well.
Absolutely. Monica.
Ditto to everything everyone has said, apart from prioritizing, but also looking at the gaps. I mean, I think we have to say progress has been made. It's not been great, it's not been complete, but how can we go through that review? And this is where partners such as the World Bank come in to help support this reform process be much more seamless, or to go over where the gaps are. So I think that's also engaging all stakeholders to support the reform process as well.
So taking that point that you just made, Monica, and going into the final question that I will cover, there's a question here that sort of says, how can we work together as the World Bank Group and the IMF and others, really, to disseminate data to parliamentarians to advance reforms? Monica, maybe I ask, I go with you because you've sort of had the experience from multiple angles on this one.
Can I expand it not to just parliamentarians, to also policymakers and the private sector policy associations? I think the great thing about the World Bank and the IMF, or the World Bank Group, is that you have a lot of data at your fingertips. You do a lot of the studies and the research. It's more translating it in a way in which our key decision makers, our policy makers, are able to act upon it, to implement the change, and in a manner in which they're able to, for it to be effective. I think also ensuring that they understand why it is a priority. There are so many things that many of the countries in Africa are going through, and you have to be able to provide a link to say that, look, this is also, if we do not address this, you actually will not be able to achieve your developmental goals or job creation, all these things. And so this also has to be in your planning. And we can work with you using the data that we have for you to prioritize, for you to also talk to your constituents about some of the things that you're doing and achieving. Yeah.
Rishi, do you want to come in on this one?
Yes, thank you. I think there are multiple angles on which we can hit this. One is collaborating on specific countries, specific cases, specific sectors, specific policies. Another is we do actually collect data like the Financial Access Survey. It goes to some of the points that were raised in the conversation, credit to by gender, credit provided, or bank accounts by gender. There's also individual capacity development, reports that go into very specific detail on certain institutions. They're great at elaborating at a country level, but we are not so good in translating that data into a format that could then be utilized for cross-country analysis. So this is wide open space. I think with AI and other tools, hopefully we'll be able to find a way to extract the relevant data and then be able to tell narratives, tell stories that could be useful more broadly. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Antonia, do you want to come in on this too?
Yeah, I think we as an organization rely on the comprehensive global data that the World Bank is able to provide. And what we're able to do is really collect examples, textual examples of those laws. What do they actually say? What do they look like? And how do they impact women and girls in their real lives? So it's definitely an important balance, I think, between just raw data and numbers and, how does it really affect people, and what world do we want to see, in the future? Thank you.
Perfect. So I have 4 minutes, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists for just a 30-second parting shot to the online audience and to the audience in the room. What do you want people to sort of walk away from for here? So Monica, over to you.
Yeah, I think I want people to walk away from the fact that we are seeing so many women want to become entrepreneurs, and not of micro businesses, really want to grow their businesses, impact the communities they live in and their families. But this won't happen if we do not support and encourage their and really address some of the legal and other barriers that are affecting this growth. And for many of our countries, we will not win if half of us are not able to access or not able to grow our businesses. So we really need to remember that front of mind, that all the things we are trying to do, all the work we're trying to do around growing our economies also needs to factor in women entrepreneurs, and we need to support them by looking at things like laws and reforms.
Thank you. Rishi.
Gender is macro-critical. It benefits not just the women, but the societies. We cannot build resilient societies if more than half the world's population is consistently left behind. It will not happen by itself. Just because education gaps are closing, it does not mean all the other gaps will close. We have not seen it, and it's not going to happen. We need to be intentional. We need to be systematic. We need to integrate it. And we need to have these front and center in all our conversations with the policymakers or civil society that we have. Thank you.
Perfect. Antonia.
Yes, I think really to create that more just and equal world, we really do have to come together around specific issues and also advocate with governments to really look comprehensively at the issues. We need to support the local grassroots organizations at a much higher level because they're doing the work on the ground and they will help to achieve that change. We also need to really invest in those collaborations and coalitions like the Alliance for Universal Digital Rights or the Global Campaign for Equality and Family Law, which is really trying to work at global, regional, and national levels, really to get us to 2030 and not 2310.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to close out by just honestly saying that this has been a great conversation. I can't thank each of you enough for participating, for bringing your insights. I think there's been a depth of knowledge amongst the panelists that really has been fabulous. And so just really, Antonia, Rishi, Monica, and Ethiopis, a very big thank you. I think there are two things that I sort of want to close out. And I want to, the one first is really that we know that this work yields positive results. And I think the more that we can do to push this agenda, the better off we will all be. And second, we know that we are actually very energized and committed to doing the work to move this forward. So thank you so much for your participation today, and honestly enjoy the rest of the Law, Justice and Development Week 2023. Thank you.